Eventually, I filed past Mandela where he lay in state and made two promises to him.
Mm.
I said, I will tell as many people about you as possible.
Mm.
And I will try every day to be a little bit like alone with Mandela in the office. And he asked me a little bit about me. He asked me about my family. He asked me where I was raised. And then he said something to me that has always stuck with me. And he says, Etienne, I trust you with my life.
Hard at times to separate the fact that you were protecting him but also, the sense of reverence. And did anything ever cloud sort of your ability to protect Mandela because of this giant that you're beside?
On the contrary, we knew what was at stake. I think so. It didn't. His greatness and what he meant to South Africa and what he was leading was so significant. But it was a reminder to us every day that we had to keep him alive.
Hey everyone, Rupesh Patel here, host of the Two Nobodies podcast, and you just heard from Etienne Van Eck. Etienne was a bodyguard, a protector for Nelson Mandela. That's right, Nelson Mandela, one of the giants in human history. We talk about Mandela's legacy. We talk about what it was like, the mechanics of protecting Nelson Mandela. He's just such a dynamic individual that just the security threats and concerns that they would have had in trying to protect him. We talk about what Mandela's legacy looks like today and things that we could learn from Mandela and his time in leading South Africa, but him as a leader and a human in general. It's a really, really interesting episode. It is the longest episode that I've recorded, but for good reason. There's so much to take away, and the stories you hear from Etienne, I don't know if many have heard these things about Nelson Mandela. So if you are someone that admires Nelson Mandela or are curious about him and his impact on South Africa and the world and on leadership, this is absolutely the episode for you. Like and subscribe, and I hope to hear many of your comments. Cheers.
Welcome to the Two Nobodies podcast with my dad.
Hey, Etienne, so good to see you again, my friend. I'm so honored to have you on the podcast. It's not so often, I think, that you get to talk to someone who is protected, a world leader, let alone one of the greatest humans ever, when we're talking about Nelson Mandela today. So, Etienne, welcome to the Two Nobodies podcast. It really is a privilege to have you on today, and I'm so looking forward to sharing your story with everyone and the lessons of Nelson Mandela and his legacy and all that. So welcome. Appreciate having you.
Thank you. Nice to be here with you, Rupesh. And thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this, and it's great to see you again.
Awesome. When I was thinking about you protecting Nelson Mandela, for you, did you see that as sort of an honor when you first started protecting Mandela, or did you just see it as sort of a part of your job?
Well, I suppose I don't think I really acknowledged it as the honor it was. Maybe it's because I just saw it as part of the job. Maybe I wasn't paying too much attention about the change that was going on in South Africa. But I soon realized, after my first meeting with Nelson Mandela, that I was close to greatness. And what turned out is I had a front seat. I saw firsthand how Nelson Mandela changed the course of history in South Africa.
Tell us about that first meeting when you first met Mandela.
Well, I think perhaps I'll start, Rupesh, by giving just some brief background as to why I do presentations about Mandela and why I engage in podcasts with awesome people like you, like this one. It flows from a promise that I made to Nelson Mandela. many years ago. It's not so many, actually, 11 years ago. When Nelson Mandela died in December 2013, I remember where I was. I was sitting in my office here in a dark and gloomy Vancouver. It was early December 2013. I was preparing for a very important meeting. I don't even remember how that meeting went. But at the end of that day, I walked out into a wet Vancouver street, feeling like the world was really weighing heavily on me. I came home. I saw the sadness in South Africa. It was early morning there. But then I also saw people celebrating Mandela's life, laughing, singing, clapping hands in the groups that had formed in South Africa. Pretty soon I made the decision to go back to South Africa. And I knew I wasn't going to make it to Mandela's funeral, but I wanted to go there just to repair, just to return a gesture that Mandela made to me many years ago. Then I got on a plane. I flew to South Africa. I knew I wasn't going to make it to his funeral, but I just wanted to be there just one more time, closer to Nelson Mandela. And from the airport, I went straight to the Union Buildings. That's the Union Buildings where I met Mandela for the first time. And I'm coming back to your question that you asked me about that first meeting with Mandela. But from the airport, I went straight to the Union Buildings.
What are the Union Buildings, Etienne?
Oh, I'm sorry. Union Buildings is it's the government offices.
Okay.
Overlooking the city of Pretoria.
Okay.
And the office of the president is there, and a lot of other offices. So when Parliament isn't in session, the government offices move up to Pretoria, and they mostly sit at the Union Buildings. Thanks for asking that. And I didn't realize when I got to the Union Buildings that they were assembly points very far away from the building where people had to get in buses and get bused to where Mandela was lying in state. And I didn't realize that. So I engaged in a little bit of trickery and tricked myself into that area where long lines were standing, waiting to file past Mandela, thousands of people. And we will all remember the 1994 democratic elections when Mandela was elected president. I didn't stand in those long lines. I was a policeman. I walked to the polling station, showed my identification, and voted. I was in and out in 5 minutes. So I think it was a powerful moment for me to stand in those long lines in that hot African sun, waiting to see Mandela one last time. A lot of reflection as I stood there. And eventually I filed past Mandela where he lay in state. And it was actually quite quick. But I made two promises to him. I said, I will tell as many people about you as possible. And I will try every day to be a little bit like you. And I think that's the one of the reasons why I do talks like this. My first meeting with Nelson Mandela, I often tell people, don't judge too harshly decisions made by other people who may or sometimes may not even have your best interests at heart. And there have been some of those decisions in my life. And one of those decisions was my assignment to Nelson Mandela. I didn't apply for the job. I certainly wasn't the best. I wasn't the best at anything that I did as a police officer. But I was told to go to Union Buildings. I was going to meet Mandela. I had been assigned to protect him. I met my commander there. We went together into that the office of the president, and I was introduced to him. Very soon into that meeting, he asked my commander to leave the office. Um, and I was alone with Mandela in the office. It was maybe a 5 or 10 minute meeting. And he asked me a little bit about me. He asked me about my family. He asked me where I was raised. And then he said something to me that has always stuck with me. And he says, Etienne, I trust you with my life. And I think he did, but also I think it's a bit of a risk, given my past. I was a police officer for 10 years before Mandela was elected as president. So I'm sure they checked me out and checked out my background.
Yeah.
But I think he was probably taking a bit of a risk by saying that he trusted me. But I truly got the feeling that he trusted me every single day that I worked with him, and a close bond developed between us.
You talked about the 1994, was it 1994 election? Is that
That's it? Yeah.
help people help young folks today understand what that election was like, and why that was such a captivating moment, or and personally I don't know if I fully can appreciate or understand that election myself, so maybe help folks understand why that was such a special time.
Well, it was the first time that non-white people could vote in South Africa.
1994 was the first time.
1994.
Okay.
So, the last election before that, it was a referendum in 1992. It's called the apartheid referendum. Mandela had already been released from prison, and the multi-party talks were already underway. They lasted for about 3 years in a process called CODESA that thrashed out the terms of the interim constitution that dictated a few things, but also how the first elections would play out in 1994. And of course, there was a lot of opposition to the change in South Africa. Not everybody was on board with the change that was happening.
Was that primarily from white South Africans?
I think, given the path Mandela was taking, even before he became president, he was making it clear that he would try and navigate the path somewhere in the middle, that there would be a place for white South Africans in the new South Africa. But that 1992 referendum, it was an all-white referendum. So, and the president at the time, de Klerk, called it. And I suppose he thought he was doing a good thing. The referendum was, white voters were asked to answer just one question. Do you support the process that is currently underway that is going to lead to a new constitution for South Africa? And what a lot of people heard in that question was, do you support a move to black majority rule? And declared victory in that referendum. But he only got 68% yes vote. So I suppose he saw that as a victory, but that left 31 or 32%.
Was the line 50 plus 1? Like, was it very clear that it was 50 plus 1 in order to achieve victory, or was there? Yeah, do you know?
I think I think it wasn't defined that clearly.
Okay.
But what he was seeking was a mandate to continue the negotiations. But what we must remember is that it wasn't under his control. It was inevitable. He will take a lot of credit. De Klerk is deceased now, but I think he took a lot of credit for doing the things that he did. And I suppose he might deserve some of that credit because he shared the Nobel Prize with Nelson Mandela.
Mm-hmm.
But it was inevitable because of internal pressure and because of external pressure from the international world
Mm-hmm.
that apartheid couldn't continue, not in that formal form, and that Mandela could no longer be kept in prison.
Mm.
So when they announced Mandela was going to be released in 1990, the credit doesn't belong to F.W. de Klerk.
Mm.
And in fact, de Klerk and his predecessor clung on to the status quo for too long. De Klerk less so. But de Klerk didn't like the word apartheid. He liked to call it separate development. But apartheid was the probably the most oppressive racial oppression regime known to humanity. And it's a euphemism to call it separate development. And his predecessor, P.W. Botha, I looked after him as well as a rookie, like doing gate duty, patrols around the presidential estate. He refused to go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, which was unfortunate because he could have helped a lot of white people to unburden themselves of the guilt and the trauma. And my father was one of them. My father was a policeman in apartheid South Africa. But so back to the 1994 election, a lot of people got to vote for the first time. And the people turned out, I can't remember what the voter turnout was, but in their millions, 80-year-old, 90-year-old people voting for the first time in their lives, seeing Mandela free. When he walked out of prison in 1990, you must remember there was a time when it was illegal even to publish a photo of Nelson Mandela. And to see that person walk free and to have the opportunity to participate in those democratic elections was momentous. I don't think people always realize that in South Africa. Voter turnout in South Africa is dismal. I think it's high 50s, low 60%. There's still a long road to go in South Africa. And one way to ensure that the country stays on the right path is for young people to vote.
Was there, during that 1994 election, was there a clear opposition party to Mandela? Like, did they have a chance at all, or this was Mandela's election to lose going into that one?
Yeah, it was always going to be Mandela and the ANC's election, I suppose, to lose, but that was never going to happen. The main opposition party, I can't remember what the results were, but was de Klerk's National Party. That party doesn't exist anymore. And but also, to show the greatness of Nelson Mandela, as part of the negotiation process leading to that first election, they agreed on what is known as a government of national unity. De Klerk was given a position in that government of national unity. The position was second executive vice president. And I don't think that national unity setup lasted too long, maybe a year or two. But Mandela didn't have to do that. They had an overwhelming victory in the 1994. But again, I think it just shows how Mandela saw the opportunities for nation building and and seized on those opportunities, and essentially reaching out the hand of forgiveness to the very people that oppressed him,
Mm-hmm.
that killed millions of people in South Africa and kept Mandela in prison for 27 years. When I was born, Mandela was already in prison. I grew up, I never knew Mandela, who he was.
Mm.
I grew up believing Mandela was a terrorist because
Yeah.
that's what I heard.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I heard at home. And
Yeah.
the first time I saw Mandela, it was a wooden carving of his face when I was, I think, in my early 20s. So we're talking like late 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't only incarcerate him and lock him away, but they hid him away and made up the history of Mandela as they wanted to tell it.
Mm. You just talked about how de Klerk was a part of Mandela's government. Do you know if by including, like that's so powerful to include your opposition as a way of uniting the country? Do you know if, in any way, by including the opposition, whether that uh, hurt his ability to govern the country in any way? Like, did it create any roadblocks? Did it kind of slow down the progress that he was hoping to make in any way? Like, did it kind of backfire, I guess is what I'm asking.
Um,
Do you
I
know?
think, yeah, I probably don't think it backfired.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it might have slowed down some of the change,
Yeah.
but it was important, I think, to Nelson Mandela
Mm-hmm.
to include de Klerk and send a message to white South Africans that there was a place for them uh, in South Africa, the
Mm-hmm.
place that they regard as home. And let's face it, none of those people, whether it's white people or Africans, um, none of them are going anywhere. They're going to stay. So to try and involve them and keep them involved, I think that was Mandela's strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And he, Mandela saw South Africa through the eyes of South Africans.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you some examples of that. He knew that some feared for the future,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that the vast majority of the people in South Africa were growing impatient.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they were growing impatient really quickly. Yet we traveled to rural areas, and we met with white farmers, and Mandela assured them that they weren't going to lose their farms. And again, that was probably a risk for Nelson Mandela because there was and still is, I think, a legitimate push for land redistribution in
Mm-hmm.
South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But despite that, Mandela still gave those assurances. He would spontaneously stop and speak to civil servants. And the civil service back then was predominantly white. I
Right.
do not recall one black person uh, in a senior position in the civil service. But he would stop and speak to them and say they're not going to lose their jobs. And this was at exactly the same time when affirmative action was an official policy that was being rolled out.
Mm-hmm.
As we drive through the country, around the towns, the cities, Mandela would get us to stop the car at roadworks, at construction sites, where the construction workers were all black. And he would get out. Can you imagine, can you just imagine the security
Right.
situation? Like,
Yes.
impromptu, we're going to stop here.
Yeah.
And then he'd go and speak to them and explain his plans. And I didn't understand what he was saying. He spoke in African languages,
Yeah.
but my colleagues translated for me.
Yeah.
And he'd ask him to be patient. And also sometimes at the traffic light, back then in South Africa, newspapers were sold by little kids. In my memories was, black boys, and they'd sell newspapers at the traffic lights to the cars as they stopped, at the red lights. And Mandela would call over the newspaper vendor and tell him, you mustn't only read the back pages, the sport. He says you must read the front pages, read what plan I've got for South Africa. Mandela was very good in Afrikaans. He learned to speak Afrikaans fluently, and he saw this as a way to bridge the gap between him and Afrikaners. And I think he famously said, you know, speak to a person in their language. You know, I think something about that's the way to their heart. That's how you win people's hearts, if you speak to them in their own language. I sometimes on the jet, when we'd be flying from one place to another, Mandela would call me over and ask me to translate a particular passage. And then he would read it back to me, and I'd time him because he'd want to know how long does it take him. And I remember once there's a letter in Afrikaans, one letter, it's a U, and you pronounce it I, and it means you. When you're speaking to somebody like a friend, you'll say, so nice to be with you. But the letter I, it's a capital, is when you're speaking to somebody who you respect deeply. Or sometimes when people pray to God in Afrikaans, they will use that letter. And I once said, well, he's just speaking to his group. So I used the word, the Afrikaans word for you, which is jy, J-Y. And he changed it. He didn't tell me about it, but I heard later in the speech, he used the higher form of respect. And small things mattered to Mandela. And I think that's how he slowly, one by one, won the respect of people.
That would have been very hard, I would imagine. Like, the country is ready for change, right? The country is ready to really move forward. The population is largely black, right? And they're wanting to make progress. For him to tell people, I need you to be patient, and for him to then tell white South Africans that, hey, you still have a place in South Africa. I imagine there would have been internal party opposition that he probably was facing, right? Like that. Like, yeah, I don't know. Did you see any of that, or was the country completely with him in this sort of like, yep, we're with you, we understand that we need to be patient on one side and that there's a place for us, and we're willing to move with you to bring unity across the board? Or what was that like during that moment? Like, there must have been opposition.
The internal workings of government, I didn't always see that.
Yeah.
Cabinet meetings were in camera.
Yeah.
But it was clear that from both sides, uh, or put it this way, the entire nation did not embrace Nelson Mandela. We had extreme right parties who wanted independent homelands for themselves. They wanted self-determination and a place where they, the white people, could carve out an area in South Africa and be separate and stay separate. And then we had left-wing parties, and both these parties still exist, the extreme left and the extreme right, who want aggressive land redistribution without compensation. So, yeah, we find ourselves 30 years later, but I think although the parties still exist, the situation might still be similar. I'm a little removed from South Africa,
Yeah.
from the day to day, but Mandela wasn't fully embraced by each and every South African. but he sought opportunities to create, call it coalitions, and to bring people together. Every little opportunity, and there's many examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you an example that is really important for me.
Mm.
It's the date December 16th. In South Africa, December 16th, when I was growing up as a kid, it was almost like a really holy religious day.
Mm.
Um, it commemorates, we used to commemorate on December 16th a victory by the, the settlers. In Afrikaans, they are called the voortrekkers. I'll call them settlers here because that's what they were. They had this battle against the Zulus in 1838. History has it that they prayed to God and they said, "Give us victory this day and we'll forever hold this day holy."
Mm.
And indeed, they beat the Zulus. They had guns. And the day was commemorated. So I was talking earlier about the union buildings and
Yeah.
those long lines that are stood in. Glancing from the union buildings across Pretoria towards the southwest, you see another little hill, and on that hill is a massive building. You can see it from very far away. It's the Voortrekker Monument. It's a monument that commemorates that battle.
Mm.
And it was known as the Day of the Covenant or Day of the Vow,
Mm.
commemorating this promise to God. And this day when God, according to the Afrikaner, took sides.
Mm.
I personally don't think God micromanages in that way and takes sides in wars. But Mandela, after he became president, um, that day was changed to the Day of Reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
How beautiful is that?
Mm.
And I was there on the Day of Reconciliation in 2013 after
Mm-hmm.
Mandela
Mm-hmm.
died. The night before that day, I was at a dinner with friends. I was beholden to them because they were taking me around. And at the dinner was a couple who weren't Mandela fans,
Mm.
and they had made the comment that this week, meaning this week, after Mandela died, Mandela got more attention than God. And so I said, well, it depends on your perspective. And I say, but I'll tell you this. Believing in Nelson Mandela didn't require faith. I saw what that man did.
Mm-hmm.
And then he explained a little bit further what his comment meant. And he was talking about the Day of the Covenant and how, it must be commemorated. And every year, people should give thanks to God for the victory back in 1838. And he called it by its own name, by its old name, the Day of the Covenant. He was speaking Afrikaans.
Mm.
And I said to him, it's the Day of Reconciliation. And I won't repeat his response here, but he used foul language to say what they, meaning the black people, can go do. And he says, I've got no interest in reconciling with them. And that is, I think, the mentality, this was 2013,
Yeah.
that I think stands in the way
Mm.
of progress. When people are not willing to enter into a process of reconciliation and explore what that means, then the thing that comes before reconciliation, the truth bit, they're not even prepared to go and reflect
Yeah.
and look in their hearts and see what this system of racial oppression did to millions of people in their own land.
Yeah. I mean, we face the same challenge here in Canada, right? With uh, TRC, with Indigenous peoples, right? There are many people who resist to become aware of the truth, let alone go through the reconciliation process. So I only imagine that it's potentially even more intense in South Africa. You talked about Nelson Mandela kind of stopping on the roadside and wanting to talk to different people. I'm just curious about, like, did he care much about his own personal security?
Um, it's yeah, I don't think so. Sometimes
Yeah.
he created the threats,
Yeah.
and I mean that very kindly.
Yeah.
And I'll give you some examples other than those that I've
Yeah.
spoken about. Um, I we were. This is not really an example, but it comes to mind now. We were at the memorial service of the then Israeli Prime Minister
Mm,
Yitzhak Rabin,
mm,
who was assassinated by, I think, a extreme right-wing student
mm.
who had made it right up through
Yeah.
the inner circle of
Yeah.
bodyguards, and I think had either stabbed or shot Yitzhak Rabin to
Mm,
death. And there was a memorial service outside Johannesburg at a huge synagogue.
mm-hmm,
And in the aftermath of that, there were questions raised about, how safe is the president?
mm,
And specifically, Nelson Mandela,
mm,
who's surrounded by people who are from all walks of life,
mm-hmm,
including police officers like me,
mm-hmm,
police officers from the apartheid regime. And I remember seeing him on TV saying that I trust my team to the hilt. And he said, sure, people can maybe take a pot shot at me, but I trust these men and women and I'm safe with them. And that was important for me to hear. And often Mandela would actually point out to me, standing somewhere in the shadows, and say, "This is Etienne Van Eck, an Afrikaner boy. I trust him with my life." And it was very humbling for me to hear that,
yeah.
um, given what he said to me that first day when I met him. But Mandela sometimes would, he would, in the morning, typically, he would take a long walk. Sometimes it'd still be dark,
You
but he'd
guys would
get
know.
up.
You folks would know that he's about to take a walk.
Yeah, so we typically he would walk every morning,
Okay.
no matter where we were.
Yeah.
But when he was staying at one of the presidential residences,
Mm-hmm,
we knew it, right? And then the day before, when we dropped him off at home, we'd say we'd see you at whatever time, and we'd go for a walk,
mm-hmm,
and that normally worked. But one day we arrived, and we always arrived before, like in good time. And we were waiting in front of the front door, and the president didn't come out. So we went to
okay.
the gate and said, "Where's the old man?"
Yeah.
And they said, "No, he's left already." So I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No, he just walked out." I said, "Didn't you stop him?"
Yeah.
So I can just imagine the poor guy at the gate. I mean, he probably got totally dominated by Mandela,
Yeah.
and obviously didn't think about stopping him. So we, heavy laden with firearms,
Yeah.
dressed in suits, radios, um, we start running to where, in the direction where Mandela has walked,
But
and
you don't know where he's going at all, or is it kind of still a controlled environment at this point, or
it's a controlled environment until it's not.
okay.
So it was up a hill that he had walked, but this hill is probably 1 kilometer.
Okay.
And we ran up there and then got to another gate, and they said, "Yeah, he turned right here. And where he turned right outside of that gate was like walking on the upper levels highway that runs through North Vancouver, alone in the shoulder on that road. And we eventually catch up to him. And out of breath, tired, we must have run 2 kilometers. And he sort of, he says nothing, except, he looks over at us. He says, "Oh, I'm glad you boys are keeping up your fitness." And the walk would continue. We'd walk along, and can you imagine? Walking along that highway, and sometimes he would spontaneously stop, like if he like what we now call Administrative Assistance Day. Back then was Secretary's Day. He would say, "I want to buy flowers for Mary," and I would say something like. Uh, Sure, we'll get one of the cars to stop in. No, I want to go buy flowers for Mary. So we divert and we stop outside. Think of all the big shopping malls. Where you are, Rupesh, and yeah, in Vancouver as well. And in pulls a presidential convoy in the parking lot, and out gets Mandela. And we only a handful of people, and so sometimes Mandela created these situations that were difficult to control, but he was spontaneous that way. There's this really big road race. I've run it a few times. It runs from one city to another city. And this particular year, it was being run and to finish in a city called Durban. The race is called the Comrades Marathon. Mandela landed in Durban, and as we were going to the official residence, I had explained to him that we're going to take a bit of a detour because the Comrades Marathon is being run, and it's they're currently approaching Durban. They're running through the city, and they're approaching the stadium where they finish. And Mandela said, "I want to go there," and it wasn't planned. So it's 10 minutes from where we are to the stadium, and we start getting, the local authorities, getting them on the radio. In come the motorcycles, they escort us in there, and the stadium is full, watching these the winners come in. And by some luck, Mandela walks in there, and just as he walks onto the home stretch where the runners are finishing, uh, a female athlete by the name of Maria Buck actually finishes as the first female runner that day. But also, Mandela liked to mingle with the crowds. And there was no time to check out those crowds, to check out the stadium. And on this particular day, a young girl walked up to Mandela. She was selling balloons, I think, for some cause. And Mandela said, "Yeah, he wants a balloon." So I dig in my hands, in my pocket, and I bring out, I think it was 2 rand at the time, for the balloon. And as I'm doing that, Mandela says, "No, I want to buy the balloon." So I'm thinking, really? You've got change in your pockets? And he pulls out change, and he fishes out 2 rand, and he gives it to this little girl, and she'll never, ever forget that moment. I felt like a fool, really, right? Because I should have known better. I should have known that this is the man Mandela. The personal touch and paying attention to each and every South African was important to him.
It sounds like it's truly authentic too. It's not show. It sounds like it's a part of his fiber and his being, hey?
I think one of the things that distinguishes Mandela as a leader is that he didn't change his principles depending on who he was dealing with. And he was consistent, no matter what pressure he was getting. And, he he came to South Africa. I mean, to the United States after he was released from prison. And I think people thought he was going to, you know, beg for assistance or money or
Mm.
something. And he got a lot of criticism uh, for his support and his party, the African National Congress's
Mm.
support, for people like Yasser Arafat, Fidel Castro, Colonel Gaddafi. And he he didn't come here and say, "Oh yeah, you know we're sorry about that."
Right.
He said we support those people to the hilt, and he says our position to other countries is dictated by their position to our struggle.
Mm.
And he was talking about our struggle against apartheid. But at the same time, those same people, like Colonel Gaddafi of Libya, was pressurizing Mandela, was saying the ANC can't open offices in Libya because the ANC had Jewish members. And Mandela said they are part of our party, they
Mm.
are part of our country.
Mhm.
So, again, just another example that Mandela just didn't change
Mhm.
depending on who he was dealing with.
Mhm.
He was consistent.
Mm.
And I think what people sometimes forget is way back in the early 1960s, when Mandela was sentenced to lifelong imprisonment, there's this very famous speech from the dock where Mandela speaks at length about his commitment to the struggle. And he says, I have committed my life, all my life. I've fought against black domination and I've fought against white domination.
Mhm.
And he says, it's an ideal um, that I want to live for.
Yeah.
But if needs be, it's an ideal that I'm willing to die for. And a lot of people forget that. And he was inviting people to sentence him to death. This was 1960.
Mm.
Um, but he wasn't one sided. He fought domination, racial oppression, wherever he saw it.
Mhm. Sounds like he had a bit of a mischievous side too, hey, in protecting him. Like, the fact that he makes that little sly comment after you come back to him. It's like it's a little test there, and kind of poking you guys at times. That's a security. That sounds like a security challenge for sure. And I would imagine that you folks probably did numerous security reviews, and after these kind of incidents and stuff, or like how he's able to bypass some of those guards without them even notifying you folks, like, hey, like he's out there walking, like, that seems a little bit funny to me.
Yeah, and I mean, you must remember, I was 18 when I went to the police. I was
Right.
carrying a firearm before I had a driver's license.
Yeah.
So, um, so those people at the gate were probably no older than like 19.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is, I mean, they were probably just like overawed uh, by the person in front of them
Yeah.
and never resisted. But yeah, and we'd adjust.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela, whenever there was a big rally or big public event,
Hmm.
and if there were any children in attendance,
Hmm.
he would always want to go thank them. If it was
Hmm.
a children's choir of
Hmm.
80 people,
Hmm.
he would say, "I want to go and thank those children."
Hmm.
And he didn't stand in front of them and thank them. All the little kids would line up, and Mandela would shake their hands one by one,
Hmm.
and he'd go. They'd file past him, and again, those little kids are adults now,
Hmm.
and I'm sure they remember those moments.
Hmm.
And uh, one of the adjustments we used to make as well was to have a dummy convoy. We'd have a convoy that looked exactly like our convoy, and it
Hmm.
would roll in to the entrance of a building, and everybody would rush there, the media and everyone else, and we'd roll in really quietly at another entrance, and
Hmm.
Mandela would make it in. We didn't always do that,
Yeah.
but sometimes we did that. And you talk about his mischievous side. Sometimes he would put us on the spot. Um, I remember once we went to a banquet, and the chief judge of South Africa was in attendance, and we were walking up the stairs, and there was this big landing chief justice was standing there to greet Mandela,
Mm-hmm.
and while they going through the greeting, Mandela turns to me and he points to me. He says, "Ah, this is Etienne. Etienne is studying for his LLB. Etienne, do you have any questions for the Chief Justice?" And totally, impromptu, unplanned.
Yeah,
And
I love it.
I'd say something stupid like, "Not at this time, sir," or
Yeah.
whatever. Just like, but the man never missed a beat. One of one of my most, I've got a few special memories of Nelson Mandela.
Mm.
In Cape Town, we were at a banquet, at a state dinner. Uh, Mandela was hosting the French president,
Mm.
Francois Mitterrand.
Mm.
And I don't think it was planned, but one of the delegates of the French delegation uh, was a woman with the most beautiful operatic voice. And she stood up. There was no music. She stood up right where she was standing.
Mm-hmm.
And she started singing that song, "He's Got the Whole World in His
Mm.
Hands." And I think that's one of the moments where I just realized I'm so close to greatness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I appreciated that every day. Mandela was also, just a compassionate, caring man.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bond between Mandela and I continued long after I was no longer working with him. I'd already moved to Canada, and I had um, a personal setback, a tragedy in my life,
Mm.
and that also took me back to South Africa. And unfortunately, I go back to South Africa sometimes for really good stuff. But unfortunately, like most people, when you go to another country, you go back to your own country for funerals and
Mm.
death.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there, Mandela wasn't even the president yet, but the
Mm-hmm.
phone rang, and it was Nelson Mandela. I think my former team or people who were still protecting him had told him.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a long conversation, and he asked me about, my life in Canada. He asked me about my family. He always asked about our families. And he said to me, "Etienne, you have the courage um, to triumph over
Mm.
this tragedy." And I reflect a lot on that. But one thing I know, that is exactly what Nelson Mandela did. Showed courage throughout his life, um, to triumph, to lead a country out of the tragedy, which was apartheid. Probably um, one of the most oppressive regimes known to humanity.
Mm-hmm. Those are some incredible stories, Etienne. I mean, it's clear you get a sense from, like, everyone's going to get a sense from you that, you revere and cherish, um, that relationship with Nelson Mandela, and just like you said, you're so close to greatness. Was it hard at times to separate the fact that you were protecting him, and but also, the sense of reverence? And I don't know if that existed in that moment when you're protecting him, or yeah, were you able to separate the two, or did anything ever cloud sort of your ability to protect Mandela because of this giant that you're beside?
I think, uh, on the contrary, we we knew what was at stake.
Hmm.
I think so. It didn't. his greatness and what he meant to South Africa and what he was leading
Mm-hmm.
Was so significant.
Yeah.
But it was a reminder to us every day that we had to keep him alive. We had to
Mm-hmm.
do our best to ensure that he didn't get hurt. Because what could have happened in South Africa if that had happened? South Africa was on a knife edge during that change.
Mm.
There was lots of events. A great leader of the South African Communist Party, Chris Hani, was assassinated over Easter weekend on a Sunday morning as he walked down his driveway to go and pick up his newspaper. A Polish immigrant and a member of, I think, the South African Communist Party were eventually sentenced to prison because of that assassination. And Mandela wasn't president yet, but Mandela took to the airwaves. He went to the South African Broadcast Corporation, and they put him on TV, and he laid a calming hand on that nation because it was a racially motivated assassination of a great man who was revered in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Mandela, not F.W. de Klerk. It was Mandela who took the air, even as before he was a president,
Mm-hmm.
and calmed the nation. And I think I remember where I was when Chris Hani was killed. I was in South Africa again, running a long road race,
Mm-hmm.
and you could feel the tension
Mm-hmm.
that I think was to be expected, given that two white people, one person pulled the trigger, but the other person was the instigator. Two white people conspired to kill a one of the leading black figures in South Africa. And regardless of that environment, it would have been a lot worse had that happened to Nelson Mandela
Mm-hmm.
when he was president.
Yeah. I want to. Sorry, I'm just processing. You know, like that's. You said the country is at a nice edge, protecting him during that time. Enormous amount of challenges, plus this sort of. He wants to be with the people. He wants to. He feels this need to genuinely connect with folks, to reassure them that while there's going to be change, that you know you're part of the country. There's so many dynamics in place, and so for you folks as the protectors of him, I can't imagine the challenge that you folks are facing to balance that entire to manage that entire environment. So um, yeah, you talked about his leadership, and I want to just maybe focus on that a little bit because I want to draw it to what we see perhaps today, and I don't expect you to comment on anything because you know none of us are really experts in this sort of thing, but so it's mainly based on just you know your observations and what you're seeing today. But a couple of things stood out about what you said to me, what you said about his leadership. One, his principled approach to leadership, followed his principles at all in all situations. His consistency in applying those principles, um, and then his understanding of how to meet people at where they're at. Right. So understanding that with change, you don't just move change at all costs. You got to bring people along if you you know believe in a unified environment. Those three things sometimes I feel at least on the surface level we don't know what's going through every world leaders minds, right? Maybe they're all trying to aspire to do the similar things, we don't know, but on the surface it seems like some of those characteristics of leadership are missing today. Do you feel that in any way from what you see with world leaders today?
Um, yeah, I think it's lacking, and we do not have a leader in the world like Nelson Mandela. And I'll tell you a little bit more about him, and that might serve as an example of why I say we do not have leaders like him. So this time of year, I spend a lot of time outside here in my backyard in the garden. And one thing I didn't know about Nelson Mandela, and I only learned this when I read his book, Long Walk to Freedom. Now, I've got a treasured copy of Long Walk to Freedom. He signed it for me, but I never read it. I always used to joke. I said, I know the story. But I started reading Long Walk to Freedom when I boarded the plane in 2013 to go to his funeral. And in that book, I learned that Nelson Mandela was an avid gardener. And he gardened on Robben Island. And he says, in many ways, I saw my garden as a metaphor for many aspects of my life. And he says, a gardener, like a leader, plants seeds. And then he watches and he cultivates and he harvests the responsibility. And I don't think we see too much of that in leaders today. Mandela also told a story in his book about when he was a kid. They used to ride around on donkeys, and a donkey threw him off into a thorn bush. And he says, I learned at a very young age that to humiliate somebody is to make them suffer an unnecessarily cruel fate. He says it's possible to defeat your opponent without dishonoring them. And if we see how political opponents, go at each other and how they treat each other and what they say of each other, I think it reflects more on them than what it does on their opponents.
Yeah.
Mandela didn't do that. I mentioned earlier, he took time, to get to know South Africans. And that's important because it ensures you don't get separated from the people you represent. And I think it was the proposition that his way of doing things stands for, is that if you really get to know people, it's really hard to treat them poorly. And Mandela didn't suddenly become this way. He's always like that in his life. Like one of the former presidents after Mandela said, what made him so great was precisely what made him human. And again, I think better people make better leaders. Mandela knew that involving people in something productive is one way of ensuring that they don't become negative. It doesn't always work, but he tried.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think he also involved people like me and kept me informed. I spoke to him a lot of times because if you do those two things, you involve people and you keep them informed, chances are they're going to make a big impact. And sometimes I think I was, one of those people that was involved and made, I wouldn't say a big impact, but I made a little impact nonetheless. Mandela used to tell this story, and it's about a young man, but you can substitute gender any way that you choose.
Yeah.
But and I don't know if it was his story or someone else's story that he was telling, but the story is about this young boy who grows up in this village in Africa, and he becomes restless, and he wants to go see what's outside of this little village, and also he wants to go meet his partner in life. So he leaves the village, travels the entire world, across oceans, across mountains, to continents, meeting all the famous and well-known, highly educated people. And I don't know how long, but in my mind, it's years later. Despondent and defeated, he returns back to the village, just to find that his childhood friend, the young girl who used to play with all his life, has grown up to this person who he finds out is in fact the person he initially went out to go and find.
Mm.
And the punchline, the moral of the story is that familiarity breeds contempt. And sometimes the solution or the people we are looking for is right here in our midst. And we just have to see it as leaders. We just have to be able to see it, and not always look for solutions elsewhere or to rely on other people
Mm.
to come up with the solutions.
Yeah, that's a great story. This feeling of that you have towards Nelson Mandela, do you feel like in modern day South Africa that that reverence for him is still there? And I bring that up because I think about Mahatma Gandhi, right? And there's certainly I've seen the comparisons between the two individuals, and there may have been lessons that Mandela maybe took from Gandhi in several ways. The sense of wanting to unite India and ensure that this wasn't just a Hindu country, but that Muslims in Pakistan and what's now modern day Pakistan, but Muslims were also a part of the country, and the number of fastings he did because he saw this division and he didn't want it to happen. In protest, he fasted, right, and did those hunger strikes to ensure the country was united. Um, but now, if you look at modern day India, a very strong movement of Hindu nationalism, and a lot of those Hindu nationalists are not fans of Gandhi and what he tried to achieve, including arguably the current prime minister there as well, right? So just curious about if there's similar movements in South Africa that you're aware of, or do you have a sense of whether maybe that reverence isn't as strong for Mandela as maybe as it once was when he first um, came to the scene and ultimately became president.
I, th- I think, well, firstly, I think too, you know, Mandela is a role model to many people, but
Hmm.
Mandela too had his role models.
Mm.
And Gandhi was one of them. And so was Martin Luther King.
Mm.
And uh, I think now, 30 years later, after he became president, there is um, uh, I think, a bit of a slump. And the recent polls in South Africa show that in support for the African National Congress. And sometimes people will, also say, well, look at Mandela's party. Mandela's party is, starting to fail miserably and has always failed. And to them, I say, well, it's not Mandela's party. The ANC was formed in 1912,
Hmm.
and Mandela was only born in 1918.
Hmm.
Um, but there is a sentiment, and again, I'm not in South Africa, but I speak to people, and the people I speak to are mostly white people. A sentiment that Mandela's dream or his vision has never materialized. In fact, we're in worse position now than what we were, before Mandela. And I ask those people to reflect what they are saying. Reflect on what they are saying. You are saying that apartheid is better than the
Mm.
situation that exists in South Africa. And how are you hurting the majority of South Africans by saying that? Now, having having said about all that, I acknowledge there's a lot of corruption in South Africa.
Hmm.
South Africa, uh, the Electricity Supply Commission is failing to deliver. South Africa has what is called as rolling blackouts.
Mm.
Um, Cities would have no power for a certain amount of time. I think they get warning, like, it's going to be a blackout and the lights go out. But again, I think I mentioned earlier, there's always been corruption
Mm-hmm.
in governments. Apartheid was probably the ultimate corruption,
Mm-hmm.
although it's a bit euphemistic to call apartheid corruption. I think Mandela would 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 be somewhat disappointed
Mm-hmm.
in the progress that is made in South Africa, and but I think there will be lessons in how he will express that disappointment. And what I mean by that is, again, he's always looked for opportunities to realize this vision of people in South Africa living in harmony with equal
Mm-hmm.
opportunities. And Mandela didn't always look only at what was in front of him. And I'll give you an example of that. In 1995, we all know what happened in the famous Rugby World Cup against the New Zealand All Blacks. South Africa, with the support of the entire nation and Nelson Mandela, won that World Cup. And Mandela was criticized quite heavily for supporting a all white but one South African Springbok rugby side,
Mm-hmm.
wearing the famous Springbok on their chest, which was seen by many as a symbol of oppression.
Mm.
But Mandela didn't do that just for because he wanted to win the World Cup. It was an opportunity to unite the nation, but also talk about vision. What Mandela saw was what we saw in 2019 and again in 2023, when South Africa, both those World Cups, won the World Cup with a black captain hoisting that World Cup above his head in a rugby team that is so much more representative of the South African population
Mm-hmm.
than what it was in 1995. And I think that's the power of a leader who can have a vision, even although if others can't see it. Mandela didn't say, I've got this 10-point plan. He said he had a vision.
Mm-hmm.
And his first step was to support that rugby side in 1995. I think Mandela ends his book, Long Walk to Freedom, by saying, I've walked the long walk to freedom. I've had some successes, but I've also made mistakes. And he says, now I'm standing at the top of this hill. And I take just a brief moment and I look around and I look at this beautiful vista around me. But I can't linger too long because there's still a long road to ahead. There are more hills to climb.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, it's a wake-up call for the African National Congress, this most recent election. And it's in their hands to see, because again, we have in South Africa what is known as the Government of National Unity.
Mm-hmm.
It is a great opportunity, I think. And I think one of your former guests, Prakash Dia, made the comment about the struggle continues. And, the famous phrase in, I think it's Portuguese, is a luta continua. The struggle continues. And the legacy of apartheid doesn't just go away
No.
in a decade or two. So there's a lot of work to be done. And remember, Mandela didn't fight only black domination. White domination. He fought all racial domination where he saw it. And I think if people must, I think, not think so much about Mandela the person, but look at his legacy. Look what he did and how he tried to do it, and embrace that. And two words come to mind, and one of those words is an African word, I actually think it's Xhosa, and it's Ubuntu,
Mm.
and it says, "I am because you are." And I'm probably not going to describe what it means correctly or fully, but it describes a bond of caring and a bond of sharing that connects all of humanity. And there's a very similar concept in uh, our indigenous culture here in Canada. And I learned this from a First Nations elder called Salkson, and it's the word Natsamat. And Natsamat is we are one, and we support each other,
Mm.
and we hold each other up because there's much work to be done. And I think that is what I will tell to people that might be losing faith
Yeah.
with Mandela or have never embraced him, and uh, just reflect what he has done, what he has sacrificed, and the courage and the fortitude that he showed to to triumph over a really terrible tragedy that was apartheid.
We can all recognize that the struggle continues, but I think there's, to your point, there's a place that we all have to have where we need to honor that progress that was made, right? Whether it had been by Mandela or any other sort of figure in our society. Um, why do you think we struggle with not being able to, and this is not just in South Africa, this exists across the world, where we can't acknowledge the commonalities amongst us, and that we're so focused on division? I mean, it's easier by human nature to focus on the things that divide us. I think it requires a bit of energy to put your things aside, your needs aside, to see, okay, what are those things that are common amongst us. So I think that maybe that has a factor. But for there have been several world leaders, over the past 100 years who speak in great, not only speak about this, but have taken action to show that this sense of commonality. But why do you think it's so hard for people to see that these days?
I think there's a few examples come to mind,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a I know we didn't speak about my growing up and how I was raised and the training I got in the police,
Mm.
but by the time I left high school, I believed firmly I was of the superior race
Mm-hmm.
and that I deserved every privilege that came my way. Um, and it's worrying to see uh, the really strong movement to the right, and sometimes really far right uh, in the world today. And I think it's a willingness not to focus on those two words that I mentioned, Ubuntu
Mm-hmm.
um, and Natsamat,
Mm-hmm.
and to look only at one's, call it, own group.
Yes.
And the feeling that people think they're going to lose something. Um, and I think white supremacy, privilege, and fragility are like cousins.
Mm.
And they show up in various ways. And it's very easy for people to divert attention from those things by saying, oh, it's the economy or it's a security issue. That's why, we opposed to this immigration policy
Mm-hmm.
or, border or whatever.
Right.
And, but we have to be very careful for what people are saying, because what is behind it is something a little more sinister
Mm-hmm.
And I think they, there are several examples of that going on in the world at the moment. And Mandela wasn't like that. I mean, he focused on building a nation, and this is a nation where a very small group of the population uh, had all the benefits. Black people were living in squalor, without electricity, without
Mm-hmm.
running water, at the time when Mandela was released from
Mm-hmm.
prison. And there's still a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And the danger of these world leaders is how they are waking up something really sinister
Yeah.
in people that are hanging on to every word that they say
Mm-hmm.
and believing it as fact. There was this artist, a singer in South Africa. They called her Mama Africa. She's deceased now, and her name was Miriam Makeba. And she said something like, "It's funny, you know nothing about the country until the white man gets there, and then the white man writes his history, and then it's like we never existed before that." And so it was with me. Um, the education I got, the
Mm-hmm.
training I got in the
Mm-hmm.
police, um, what I heard at home as a young kid, I was using those horrible words
Mm-hmm.
when I was 5 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, there's lessons in how Mandela, what he stood for,
Mm-hmm.
not only for the younger generation, but for my generation
Right.
and the generation older than me.
Did you, because you grew up in the way that you did, and with this feeling of you were part of the superior race, almost a sense of sort of white privilege, um, did you have to challenge yourself at some point to view the world as it actually was, than what you were accustomed to, or were you challenged in any way when you found out that you had to protect Nelson Mandela, or yeah, I just wondering if there was any sort of conscious effort on your part to have to make any sort of mental shifts.
I think uh, it's a it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the first time I recall actually reflecting on how apartheid was wrong, and
Mm-hmm.
I've made presentations like this where I actually make the comment.
Yeah.
Growing up in apartheid South Africa, I was oblivious about apartheid. Now, I've reflected on that
Mm-hmm.
and realized that it's just not intellectually honest, given the separation between whites and non-whites.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, the I think the first time that I truly questioned apartheid, I was in police training college. Um, I was 18 or 19, and we were taken to this area outside of Johannesburg, or one of the suburbs of Johannesburg, and we were still trainees, and we were taken there in our hundreds. And remember, the police college where I went to was all white. All my
Yeah.
instructors were white. And we were taken to this area, and we were meant to round up or catch or arrest people that weren't allowed to be there, black people.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember chasing this black man. He was probably older than me. Um, and uh, I never caught him. He ran away from me. And but I remember thinking, as I was running after him, the only reason I'm chasing this person is because he's black.
Mm-hmm.
He done nothing wrong. He just happens to be in this place.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, but was that something that changed everything for me? No, it didn't, because
Mm.
we get into a bus and we get bussed back,
Yep.
and I learn every day in my police training about all these apartheid laws and how we're going to enforce them. And part of our training, we would see videos of you know horrific violence,
Mm-hmm.
but it was black on black
Mm-hmm.
violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I never saw the footage of white policemen in a uniform that I wore
Mm.
and that my father wore, um, chasing with dogs
Right.
after black people,
Right.
shooting children in the
Right.
streets because they were taken to the streets in peaceful demonstration because they didn't want to be educated in Afrikaans. Um, but I think slowly my thinking starts changing. And then I make it, to the side of Mandela. And I think Mandela still guides me because I still have to question my own biases, decisions that I make in my life. And I think it is a, uh, a process that we must always
Mm-hmm.
uh, engage in. And ask yourself, is there something at play that is making this decision?
Mm-hmm.
And we have those examples. Um, the indigenous man on Georgia Street and his granddaughter, who were arrested by the VPD and handcuffed
Mm-hmm.
in public. And I often think, what is at play there? If
Mm-hmm.
it was my grandfather and me when I was 12, you know, white people, would that have happened?
Right.
So I think reconciliation requires many things, but it's also a matter of learning and unlearning. Because if you have been built and taught the way I was built and taught, um, there's a lot of unpacking, a lot of unlearning. And I think Indigenous people or people who have been discriminated against in the past,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's in South Africa or elsewhere, they at least want to see a commitment to allyship and reconciliation. And part of that is acknowledging the truth,
Mm-hmm.
not ignoring it and say, well, apartheid's past. Let's all get on with it.
I want to share some pictures soon, but there's one picture I know I saw where you're protecting Mandela, but you're amongst other protectors who are not white. They're Black South Africans. Was what was that like? I imagine uh, the level of acceptance probably wasn't so high when you first when they found out that what the heck is this guy doing here? I imagine that existed, right?
Yeah, uh, it's the so that group around Mandela.
Yeah,
We are all members of the Presidential Protection Unit.
yeah,
And again, Mandela saw it an opportunity. His team had to represent the the nation that he was serving,
yeah.
and it was tough, Rupesh. So we regarded them all as terrorists who were trained outside of the country, Russia, wherever, Cuba, I don't know. And but we just had these assumptions, and based on these stereotypes that they were terrorists that came in under the cover of darkness and committed acts of sabotage and worse. And they saw us as um, policemen from um, the apartheid
Mm,
regime with blood on our hands.
mm,
And we come together. One day we come together. And there's that scene in the movie Invictus. I'm a character in Invictus given the name Etienne Fader,
mm,
where the black or the white security team, four of them joined the ANC teams. That person in Invictus, his name's Jason,
mm,
and there's another one, Linga. We Those are real people. I
mm,
learned a lot from them, and I'd like to think that we taught each other, and we had a common purpose. We had one goal, and that was to keep Nelson Mandela alive. And I suppose, part of how we got to know each other better was, in a good old fashioned, police environment in the 90s, involved a, a shooting range and then a big fire and a barbecue
Mm.
and whatever went with that, but in the right order, right? Do your training on the shooting range, put the guns away,
Yeah.
and just start eating some meat. And but over time, we grew really close, and we had the perfect example. We had the example of Nelson Mandela, who
Mm-hmm.
wasn't only talking about nation building,
Mm.
but we saw every day how he was doing it.
And would you folks talk amongst each other about what was going on in South Africa, or would you try to stay away from talking about things? Or, if there were tensions amongst you folks, were there open discussions at all, or was this kind of just put to the side because you folks were just focused on protecting Mandela?
I think by and large, we sort of like not ignored it, but we avoided speaking too much about that.
Mm-hmm.
But we did also. I mean, we weren't fully successfully amalgamated. Both, right from day one.
Mm-hmm.
It might have taken some time before a white bodyguard actually rode what we call number one,
Yeah.
right, in the limo with Mandela.
Yeah.
And uh, there were some incidents that had racial undertones which had to be addressed. Uh, my memory was that we typically didn't address these things as a bigger group, but Jason and I would sometimes discuss those issues. And again, I a lot of credit to him. He knew Mandela well. I know Mandela loved Jason dearly, and I benefited from that, and I
Mm-hmm.
learned from that.
Yeah.
And but ultimately, Mandela died at a reasonably old age, and he didn't die in office,
Mm.
and I think we were quite successful.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's move to some of these pictures that you shared because they're fantastic, and I want to share them for folks. Let me just pull these up here. Let's see. All right, let's blow these up here. All right, let's talk about this photo, Etienne. What is this?
This is a photograph of my hometown. It's
Mm.
called Graaf-Reinet. And you'll see it's like shaped, the main part of the town is shaped like a horseshoe. That's the Sunday's River running around
Yeah.
the town. And there's a little hill over there, but there's some more significant mountains this side. And I often think, standing on these mountains, how much change this little town has seen, but
Mm-hmm.
also the visible division amongst the races is so clear in this picture, because that area in the horseshoe
Mm-hmm.
with the lovely trees, the green grasses.
The
One
lawns.
is
Yeah. Yeah.
the one is my high school, and I'm going back there for my 40th high school reunion in
Okay.
August.
Yeah.
And but over on the outskirts there to the top left, at the foothills there, that's where the black people were confined
Mm.
to.
Mm-hmm.
What we call squatter camps. They lived without running water,
Mm-hmm.
no electricity. They lived in squalor, and that photo might have been taken maybe 15 years ago, but you can still see. Obviously, people can live where they want now, but the reality is a lot of people still live in poverty in South Africa. But it's like a scar on the landscape that will stay there for many decades.
Absolutely. Talk about separate developments, right? You clearly can see
Yeah.
that here. This one, you and your looks like you're wearing your a uniform here or something.
Yeah. So yeah, that's not a uniform, eh? That's a what we call the safari suit.
Okay.
And so I'm a young student, police student. That's my father
Oh,
sitting
okay.
at the table,
Yeah. Yeah.
swearing me in as a police officer. So I
Oh,
worked a few shifts with my dad before I
yeah.
went up to police training college, and that must have been January 1985.
Yeah.
Um, being sworn in by my father.
Oh, that would have been special for that to happen for you, hey?
Yeah, I hate
Yeah.
the safari suit though.
Yeah. What's this one about?
The one in the uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's when I was commissioned. The two stars on the shoulder show the rank of lieutenant.
Yeah.
You get your commission from the state president. That must have been 1989. When I got my commission, my brother and I were commissioned on the same day,
Yeah.
and that photo, you can't see it that clearly, but above my right pocket on my chest
Mm.
is the my nameplate, but
Mm-hmm.
still the old South African flag,
Mm.
the apartheid South African flag on my chest. And I often look at that photo, and I think of what that uniform stands for, uh, and how that uniform enforced apartheid.
Mm.
And I also think of replacing it, with red,
Mm-hmm.
and the role that the RCMP has played
Mm-hmm.
in the hardships
Mm-hmm.
and the sometimes terrible brutality
Yep.
experienced by Indigenous people.
Yep. 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 If there was any doubt that you protected Mandela, I don't think there's any doubt here in this photo, eh?
Yeah, that's a special photo to me, Rupesh. It's taken on the back of a four by four. Mandela would typically drive through a, a stadium and go do like a lap of honor almost before he got off and went to
Mm.
the podium. And it's a lasting image, I think, of reconciliation.
Mm.
A beaming, free Nelson Mandela with
Mm.
a rather seriously looking, badly dressed young cop from the former apartheid government. And, they typically, the whole crowd would sing, sometimes 60, 80,000 people. And you'd feel the ground shake
Yeah.
as they sang and danced.
Yeah. Yeah. In this photo, what's kind of going through your mind, or how are you? What are you trying to do here? I guess.
Um, So Rupesh, just so that you know, the photo I'm seeing on my screen is still the initial one of my hometown.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Oh, I thought it was. Hopefully, folks. Okay, because on my side, need to give me 1 second here. So you're not. You weren't seeing anything. My apologies. Okay, let me just. Maybe I won't blow it up for folks, and maybe we can see it. Okay, so let me just quickly go back and show people um, this. So this is when you were sworn in by your dad
Yes,
with the safari suit. This is you wearing the old apartheid police uniform, and this is the photo that I was talking about. Sorry, my apologies, everyone. This is the photo of Nelson Mandela on the back of the 4x4. So yeah, so I guess my question here is, what are you focused on here? I guess as a protector here.
I suppose when you're that close to Mandela, you're not so concerned about things that are far away,
Yeah.
like on the roofs of the stadium, in the crowd, because there are outer circles that are looking at that, and also the stadium. is reasonably safe. In terms of, there would have been pretty good access control
Mm-hmm.
from when it was empty. And But I think as a protector that close to Mandela, you would be concerned mainly with anything approaching
Mm.
that 4x4 or getting close
Yeah.
to Mandela.
Yeah.
That big fellow walking on the ground, you can see him chest up there. His nickname actually was Tall, and he's walking on the ground, which gives you an idea of why we called him Tall.
Yeah. Totally.
But a reasonably safe environment within that stadium.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell folks about this one.
So this is the photo that I think demonstrates, the amalgamated presidential protection unit, or part of that unit, in terms of that, we, there's racial diversity.
Mm-hmm.
The group obviously didn't always look like that, but there was always that diverse look to it. But I've reflected on this photo in presentations such as this, and there's one thing missing there, and I think it is a reflection of what we could have done better in 1994. Is that there's no woman close to Mandela,
Yeah.
and so I think it was progress, but it was not perfection.
Yeah. Makes sense. This is you. Let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit for folks.
So this is there's some bold fashion statements.
You got the fanny pack going on. I see that.
Yeah, the fanny pack. We called it a moon bag, and I actually still have that moon bag. And I always say, but it's got bodyguard stuff in it.
Yeah.
This is outside Mandela's house in his hometown area, where in fact he now is buried. He used to go there over mostly over Christmas times, sometimes for weeks at a time, and he'd still be working, but he'd find some time to rest. And again, the long walks in the countryside. And this was the day that he actually signed my book, Long Walk to Freedom. And I mean, it's a posed photo. The other photos aren't posed with him. But I asked him if I could have a photo with him.
Yeah.
And it's I treasure that photo.
Absolutely treasured. We got a few more photos here. Oh, let me zoom out here.
So this is the photo that people might remember of Nelson Mandela handing the World Cup to the victorious captain of South Africa, Francois Pienaar. A momentous day when Mandela walked onto the stadium wearing Francois Pienaar's number 6 on their jersey, and the entire crowd was just chanting "Nelson, Nelson, Nelson." Truly a great day in the history of South African rugby, and also I think Mandela's role in building the nation after he became president.
And this is where you said he wore the emblem, right? That kind of represented was a symbol for apartheid Africa.
Yeah, there are people that will disagree.
Yeah.
But I think the only white people could play for the Springbok rugby side until it must have been early 80s, maybe mid 80s. And a lot of African people supported the New Zealand All Blacks. Whenever, I mean, Mandela writes about it in his book that when he was in prison on Robben Island, they didn't support the South African Springboks. They supported, any team that played against them.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was a strong move to remove that emblem, to get rid of it, like they got rid of the old South African flag.
Yeah.
But Mandela advocated very strongly for the retention of that springbok emblem. And for those who don't know, springbok is an antelope in that is quite common in southern Africa.
This one looks like it probably maybe was when you went back to South Africa at some point after Mandela passed away. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's it. That was 2013 when I went
Okay.
back for Mandela's funeral, and
Yeah.
I just loved these this statue. So those are like steel cutouts of Nelson Mandela, and that silhouette is that famous shot of him raising his clenched fist, walking out of the prison
Mm-hmm.
with Winnie Mandela when he was released in 1990. And then beside him there are children, and I just wanted to connect them. Mandela loved children. He saw them as the future of South Africa. To the little kids, he'd always sing "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" and teach them words. And to the older ones, he'd say, "You got to focus on your studies.
Yeah.
You're the next president.
Right.
You're the next doctor. You're the next teacher.
Right.
You're the next leader of our great nation.
Yeah.
So focus on your schoolwork."
Yeah. Last picture here. Let me just zoom out here.
This is a photo after the 2019 Rugby World Cup. In the middle there is the South African rugby captain again wearing a number 6 with his wife and 2 kids holding the World Cup. And this photograph captures the vision that Mandela saw for a non-racial South Africa, where everyone lived in harmony and people had equal opportunities.
Yeah.
And I know there's a road yet to go in South Africa, but this demonstrates in such a clear way that there's been significant progress.
Thanks for sharing those pictures. I'm sure people are going to love, would appreciate it as well. I've taken up way too much of your time. I'm way over a lot of time. I know I ask every guest 2 questions. It's totally up to you whether you want to do that. If you don't have time, it's totally fine. Let's do it. Okay. So the 2 questions I ask every guest besides the circle of first one, 5 for dinner question, dead or alive, who are 5 people you'd want to have supper with? And I will say there have been many who have said Nelson Mandela. So the fact that you have that one, I don't know if you've had dinner with him, but the fact that you met with him and you had this little bit of a relationship, I think many of my guests are going to be a bit jealous here. But who are your 5?
I actually had dinner with Nelson Mandela once. It was our first trip to Maputo in Mozambique. And I don't know what they were thinking, but in the guest house, they set the dinner table. And Mandela was alone, and then all of us bodyguards. And for some other reason, they set the dinner table for all of us together. And I apologized profusely to Mandela because, we would eat on the side somewhere in another room and let him have his private dinner on his own. But, and I remember they served this beautiful fish, this whole fish. And Mandela said, "Hey, let's just eat, together." And we had dinner together. But I don't think we spoke too much. But anyway, I sorted it out afterwards. I said, "Hey, we don't eat with the president." But I think one person I always think of. I'm drawn to great leaders who demonstrate humility, and of course Mandela is one. But if there's one person, and I'm assuming these 5 people will be together at the dinner table.
That's your choice entirely. Some people want them separate, some people want them together. So it's your choice.
And I think it's going to be Mother Teresa. just a humble human being. And
Yeah.
sometimes I get the impression people confuse humility with a lack of confidence.
Mm.
And I always say, look at Mother Teresa. Do you
Mm-hmm.
think she lacked confidence?
Mm-hmm.
Look at Nelson Mandela.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the the second person is somebody who has, impacted my life more than I think he knows. His name is Quinnaman, Joe Gallagher. He's Coast Salish from the Tlaman First Nations. I don't think he will mind me saying that he currently works for Provincial Health Services Authority
Mm.
here in Vancouver. I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time with Joe, and he has guided me
Mm.
in my own process, my own path uh, of reconciliation
Mm.
and unpacking stuff and unlearning. And I'm truly privileged to have that connection with Joe.
Mm.
I think I'll invite my father.
Mm.
My father is no longer with us,
Mm.
but I think uh, I I want to have the conversation that I'm having with you,
Yeah.
with my dad.
Yeah.
My dad was raised in another time. He was a policeman that was expected to be a soldier sometimes when he went to areas, like the former Rhodesia. And and then my wife Margot will always be
Mm.
invited to dinner,
Mm.
just because I can sometimes can't make conversation as well as I should, and she's just has deep wisdom,
Mm.
and I want her to meet those people too.
Yeah.
And what's a get together without children? So again, I hope his parents don't mind me mentioning his name, but there's a little boy, his name is Zane, who I'm really close to. Um, I think he will add life to this
Mm.
dinner party.
Yeah.
So I will have him there.
That's a beautiful five. Last question. Besides the circle of life, what do you know for sure?
I think every human being is capable of goodness.
Mm.
And I think uh, if it doesn't flow from you naturally every day, then I think it's cause for reflection to go look in your heart, in your conscience. Uh, what is the blockage?
Mm.
And be brutally honest with yourself and see how we can get that goodness flowing out more. Um, and let's inspire a world, not only the bigger world, but with our neighbors, in our communities, in the workplace. Um, let's inspire a culture where everybody every day just is their very best and cultivates a culture of sharing and helping and at least trying to be good.
Mm. That's beautiful. That's wonderful. Etienne, when I go through these podcast recordings, I always say if a conversation's gone past 55, 60 minutes, it's probably a pretty good one. We're almost at 2 hours. This is the longest conversation I've had, and it's flown by. I very rarely looked at the time. But I think about, okay, how am I going to wrap this up? But like in terms of like the things I want to say at the end. And especially with this one, I was like, oh, there's so much that came out of this conversation that I don't know how to sort of thank you enough because what did we eat? We started talking about just the mechanics of protecting Mandela and what that was like and the dynamics of the security to apartheid Africa to that the infamous 1994 election and everything surrounding that to a little bit about systemic racism to lessons from Mandela that can apply to date. Like there's just so much, and it was such a fluid, dynamic conversation that I just feel so privileged to have had with you this morning. And the stories that you're sharing, not many people I'm sure have heard these things. And so, you're sharing a gift to listeners today, because especially with young folks who might be listening to this, who don't know enough about Mandela beyond just knowing that he was this giant, but what made him a giant, really. And it's the nuances of him as a person and how he led, which I think really made this man, is from what I'm seeing. So thank you for sharing everything that you did and taking the time today. I truly appreciate it, and you're always welcome anytime you want to come back. So thank you so much, Etienne.
Thank you very much, Rupesh. It's my privilege. It's an honor to be with you and to speak about Mandela, and my reflect back. It truly warms my heart when it's like I'm still walking with Mandela when I speak about him and my time with him, and you've provided that opportunity, and it's beautiful. I love it. Thank you.
I felt that too, Etienne. Like when you were telling the stories, I was able to visualize you in this situation, and like you described it in such a really, really great way. And that's why I love doing these podcasts, because you can't do that in a short interview. Like you really need the time to explain these things. So yeah, it was really, really cool. So thank you again. Thanks everyone for listening today. Like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things, and we'll see you on the next episode.